Test.
Oh my goodness, it is. We're
Watching it,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
following it right there. I couldn't.
yeah, right on the parking lot.
Although Juan has told me. So why don't we come on in? We want to make use of every minute we have with our guest. So come on in. I imagine we will have more people coming in and tuning in when the World Cup game is over. I have been forbidden to give score updates. So, but needless to say, it is a very good game, and they're in extra time right now. So anyway, welcome everyone who is here. Welcome to everyone joining us online. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector, senior pastor here at All Saints Church. And welcome to the forum. And we have had really extraordinary Advent season. We've had a series where we decided that there is so much when we look around that seems hopeless or tempts us to hopelessness. And there are things that we care about, that we know need to change, but it just seems intractable. And so the first week of Advent, we had Senator Anthony Portantino here, and we looked at gun violence and where is the hope in gun violence. And then the second week, we had Sharon Crandall and Ann Noble, and two amazing members of this community who are formerly incarcerated, talking about where is the hope with mass incarceration. And then last week, we had Greg Boyle and Michael Aran here talking about all the things that put youth at risk and for trauma, and where is the hope for that. And I think we may have saved the best for last. Because we are thrilled to welcome Los Angeles County District Attorney George Gascón here, and we're going to talk about the criminal justice system. And if there's anyone that I hope has hope, it is someone in your position. So I'm going to read a brief bio in case people don't know. George Gascón is the 43rd District Attorney for Los Angeles County. He took office on December 7th, 2020, and immediately instituted a series of policies based on science, data, and research to bring change within the criminal legal system. He's working to build a national model of criminal justice reform that supports and restores crime victims and survivors while addressing mass incarceration, racism, and social systemic inequalities. On his first day in office, he ended the use of the death penalty as a sentence in Los Angeles County, stopped charging children as adults, eliminated many sentencing enhancements that do not benefit public safety and contribute to mass incarceration, and removed cash bail for misdemeanor or non-serious or non-violent felony offenses. In his first year, his accomplishments include implementing trauma-informed resources for victims and survivors of crime, embedding deputy district attorneys into communities beset by violence so they may work on systemically improving the lives of residents, launching a centralized criminal charge evaluation system to ensure greater consistency and fairness countywide in the filing of charges, identifying nearly 60,000 cannabis convictions that are eligible for dismissal, diverting many misdemeanors associated with substance abuse, poverty, and mental illness out of the criminal legal system, holding accountable law enforcement officers who violate the law and ensuring their misconduct is disclosed to the defense in cases in which they are witnesses, and convening advisory boards to give voice to constituents, including those representing crime victims in the LGBTQ, African American, and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. Let's welcome George Gascón.
Thank you.
And so, this isn't your first gig as district attorney here in LA, but both in LA and previously, what led you to run for district attorney? What hopes did you have when you were running? And what hopes did you have when you assumed the position?
Yeah, and just very briefly, for those of you that may not be fully familiar with my background, I started in policing. I did a career with the LAPD, going from the rank of police officer to assistant chief running operations, was in essence is the second, sort of the second in command in the police department. And then from there, I was a chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, and then I was a chief of police in San Francisco before our governor now, who's mayor of San Francisco at the time, Gavin Newsom, offered me the job to be the district attorney after our vice president, Kamala Harris, who was the district attorney in San Francisco, became the attorney general. I worked on her campaign. I was the only major city chief of police that supported her. And as I think many of you know, that was a very contested campaign. Steve Cooley, who was the DA in LA County at the time, actually thought he had won the race the night of the election. Obviously, that turned out to be not the case. And by the time that I was offered the job by Gavin Newsom, I have had my own personal evolution within policing. And I went from being someone, and I often tell people that, fully embrace the thoughts that, high levels of incarceration were necessary in order to create safety in our community. I was never a proponent of the death penalty, but I was not an opponent either. I believe, the concept that if you committed an adult crime, regardless of your age, you should face adult consequences. So I was very much in sync with the thinking in the 1980s and probably early 1990s. But during this period of time, I had multiple moments where I started increasingly to question the way that we were going about achieving safety in our community. The Rodney King incident and what I call today an insurrection, but like many of you probably, I call it a riot in 1992. It was one of those moments for me, and then there were others. And I worked most of my career between the east part of the city of LA and the south part of the city. So I work in places that were extremely violent, especially during the time that I was working the streets. We had over 1,000 homicides in the city of LA annually at that time. And the level of incarceration was increasing. And what I began to realize is that we were not necessarily achieving any more safety. The more that we incarcerated, the more dangerous that our streets were becoming. And so much of it was focused on, primarily in the African American community, Latino communities, very vulnerable communities. And treatment was very different. We were, for instance, arresting teenagers in South LA for minor possession of drugs, and there were felonies. But drug use in this country is not centered around poor communities of color. We know that drug use in this country has been pretty equal across the board. And I started to work outside of policing with other organizations. I became a member of the Council of State Governments Justice Center, which was primarily focusing on reducing incarceration at the state level. I started to work with the Harvard School of Public Policy, the Kennedy School of Public Policy out of Harvard University. So my thought process evolved during a period of time. By the moment that I was offered the possibility to become the district attorney, I had come to the conclusion, as many others do today, that elected district attorneys control much of what happens in the criminal legal system. And mass incarceration was really driven by elected district attorneys who were being elected on tough on crime concept, where policies that people were being incarcerated at very high levels. They were very active, not only in policy making, but also in the legislative process. District attorneys were at state capitals constantly lobbying for harsher and harsher penalties. So if we were going to turn this around, I knew that being a chief of police was not going to give me the same opportunities of being the district attorney. And that's why I became the district attorney in San Francisco.
So what actually gave you hope that this could be turned around? Because it's been decades, and some people would say centuries of policy that has gotten us to this point.
Yeah, there were so many, as I started to step out of policing and, sort of broadening my horizon and mixing in other, with other groups, another way of looking at how do we achieve safety and community health, because really safety is about community health. I began to see that there were many opportunities to start turning sort of the policies of the 1980s, 1990s around. There was even states like Texas were reducing incarceration by the early 2000s. Interestingly enough, not because of social justice, they were really focusing on the economic impact of incarceration. So I often used to tell people, I still do that, it doesn't really matter how you get on the freeway. If we get to the same outcome, we're okay. So meaning that, if your goal is to look at incarceration through the economic impact, and that leads you to get to the right outcome, then I'll welcome you. If it's social justice, obviously that's where I come from. But the point being that, mass incarceration and what we've done for so many years is broken not only economically, but it's obviously broken socially as well.
So one of the challenges I imagine of being an elected official trying to implement systemic change is that systems change very slowly. When we try to change entrenched systems, often there is, during that change period, some chaos, some pain. And as someone who has to keep responding to the public and being elected, systems generally don't want to change. Like for example, if I had to run for rector of All Saints Church after my first 3 years, I'm not sure I'd be here sitting with you right now. Systemic change is hard. So how do you balance really the long game that systemic change has to be with the need for some short-term hope and results that will keep people invested and keep you in your job?
Yeah. I mean, look, first of all, and increasingly so, I've always been a spiritual person, but I have increasingly become more spiritual as I get older. And I truly believe that we all come for a purpose, right? And and whatever the purpose is, right? And I have a strong sense of mission in what I'm doing. And so I'm passionate about the work, but I'm passionate because I believe that we're on the right side of history, right? So that gives me a tremendous amount of endurance, if you will. At the same time, recognizing, as you indicated, it is a political world, and we have to navigate through that political world because you need to survive to fight another day. This is not about becoming a hero. This is about, actually accomplishing the work. So, my focus has always been about the safety of our community. I tell people that the only shift before, to where I am today, to where I was 20 or 30 years ago, is that I believe that the path to get there is a different path. So keeping in mind that this is about the safety and the well-being and the health of our community, it's really trying to look for both, ways to show people that what we're doing is going to get us there, understanding that we have to have those short-term, things that we have to try to achieve in order to continue to be able to be in the fight, and really, trying every day to look for ways to improve the way that we do our work, even if sometimes I may think, normally that's not the way that I would want to do the work in long term, but this is what we have to do today. So for instance, I don't believe in sentencing enhancements. I really believe that those
Talk about what a sentencing enhancement is.
Yes, thank you. So the way that we send people to, once a person is found guilty of a crime by a jury, the way that we sentence someone is there's two vehicles basically that determine how much time a person is going to go to prison or jail. One is what we call the triad. So the base crime will have a sort of the low range, the mid range, and the high range of a sentence. So just purely for illustration, this is not an accurate example. Let's say that a person that committed an armed robbery, if there were a lot of mitigating circumstances, was going to face 3 years in prison. If it was a normal robbery, it would be 5 years, whatever a normal robbery is, and if there were aggravated conditions, it would be 7 years. So courts are generally told that unless there is aggravating or mitigating circumstances, your sentence is going to be the mid-range, so it will be 5 years. But now let's take someone that perhaps was identified as a gang member previously. So they're in the gang member files. So that may add an enhancement. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that that's another 2 years in prison. And then let's say that the person maybe had a prior strike. They have been arrested and convicted of another crime. There was a strike, and that adds another few years to the sentence. And the person was using a handgun, and that adds a gun enhancement. So pretty soon, what would have been a 5-year sentence could become a 15, 20, or frankly, on a second strike or a third strike, it could become, third strike could become life in prison, 25 years to life. There's absolutely no evidence that increasing the sentencing for someone is going to make us any safer. There is no evidence that serves as a deterrent. When people are committing crimes, generally they're not thinking about the consequences, and the reason for that is because generally they're not going to get caught, right? The things that actually are most effective in our system is certainty and swiftness, and we're neither certain nor swift, right? You look at how often police solves property crimes. It's usually around 12% of the time. So about 88% of the time that somebody commits a burglary or robbery, they're not going to get caught, right? Homicides, we solve about 50% of the time, right? So again, half of the time you have, the odds are 50-50 that you're going to get caught. So most people that are committing these crimes are not thinking, oh, I'm going to go to prison for X number of years. They don't think they're going to get caught, right? But what it does do is when we put people in prison for very long periods of time, and by the way, about 95% of the people that we put in prison are coming back out, is they're increasingly becoming more violent. Their criminogenic factors, the likelihood that they're going to engage in other criminal activity increases as they spend more time in prison, because our prisons do not rehabilitate people, right? They're very inhumane places where there's high levels of violence, high levels of drug use, tremendous amount of mental health problems. So people that go in and out of prison continue to commit other crimes. So using the path of the enhancements, which we seem to be addicted to as a nation, is not necessarily going to make us safer. But I recognize that people have a strong attachment to that. So one of the things that we've done after about a year and a half in the office is we've created a path. So in some exceptional cases, we might entertain adding an enhancement, even though the science doesn't say that this is going to reduce crime, right? So when I initially became the district attorney, I said we're going to stop using the enhancements, and I immediately got pummeled because of hate crimes, which, by the way, are on the increase, and they're horrendous. And so I relented on that, and primarily, a lot of people that I respect greatly say, that would send a message that it's okay to commit hate, which clearly it's not. But we went ahead and allowed hate crime enhancements to come back, purely because I knew that politically this was just not going to be, it was going to create more problems than not, even though I know that it doesn't reduce hate crimes. And in fact, the reality is that we have seen hate crimes increase during the time that we have, all these enhancements, right? What is going to reduce hate crimes is really coming together as a community and not only showing no tolerance for it, but educating our young people to respect one another, right? It's a process of education and prevention that is going to reduce hate.
Well, so that actually leads to another thing, which is, part of what you're talking about is we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to use the death penalty. We're not going to use enhancements. But then it's okay. So then what? Serge Popovich, who was, you may actually run into him at the Kennedy School. He was one of the revolutionaries who helped remove Milosevic in Serbia. He's written about how you build a movement, and he said you have to have a vision for tomorrow because you can't just run against something. And so, what is the positive vision that you have? If you could sort of wave the magic wand, what would it be? What are the principles, the positive principles that guide you in your work?
Yeah, so let's take the death penalty, for instance. And by the way, there are certain things that regardless of what the political consequences, I will not, even create an exception, right? The death penalty is one of those. For me, it's a complete non-starter. And, there are moral and there are practical reasons for that. But I think that, the hope and sort of what we see is we're already seeing a shifting in the conversation, not only in LA County, but we see it nationally, right? If you look at the recent midterm elections where for me, were a tremendous evidence that the American public is becoming more sophisticated when they look at crime. You know, the Republicans have spent a tremendous amount of time and effort throughout the country and in this community pushing for, you know, going back to the tough on crime concepts. I faced 2 recalls that failed. They've spent collectively, well, the second recall, they spent over $8 million, you know, against our $200,000 or so that we spent, and that failed. And the first one, $2 million. And, you know, Fox News was making this a daily event. You know, there were specials by Tucker Carlson about how LA was going on fire and all that stuff. And even with all of that, they were unsuccessful. And around the country, they were unsuccessful. That gives me a tremendous amount of hope. The other part of it is that I'm seeing within my office, you know, there's a silent, I know that usually you hear in the news about, you know, the members of the District Attorney Association, you know, yelling and screaming how I'm making the community less safe, and you hear a few people, but the silent majority of my office is doing the work every day and increasingly moving towards the direction of reform. When it came to fentanyl, for instance, we recently put together a work group, and I talked to Barbara Ferrer, you know, director of our public health, and Dr. Sy, and we said, you know, this really has to be, it's a public health epidemic. It's not a crime epidemic, and we need to deal with it through that lens. We brought in the school district, we were in communities, but some people in my office are saying, well, are you going to bring the police? And I said, we absolutely have to bring the police. But what happened in talking about hope is the head of the County Chiefs Association was at that press conference with us, and frankly, I had no idea what he was going to say. And he came out and said, this is about education, this is about public health, and we're going to be a partner. Yes, we're going to look at, you know, those that are hurting our community, but we understand this is a public health epidemic. And to me, that was a major breakthrough that would not have occurred 2 years ago. So I'm very hopeful that I see evidence of increasingly people understanding and evolving from their own place. And frankly, I welcome that because I myself am a product of that evolution.
Well, and so what I hear you talking about in some ways is a reframing. And you wrote a piece for the LA Times where you talked about the quote-unquote war on drugs, and we can't incarcerate ourselves out of a public health issue. And so, you know, the movement that has been sort of called defunding the police really is about a shift in funding from looking at everything as the solution is policing and incarceration to saying there are other community-based solutions that will reduce the need for this. What would you like to see get greater funding? I mean, because you've talked about diversion programs as one. What else would you like to see get greater funding that you've seen be effective?
Well, I mean, look, without getting into all the components, obviously, I'd like to see more funding for education, more funding for housing, and for public health. I think if we spend more money in those areas, I would have less work, and it would eventually could put us out of work, ideally, which that would be a good thing. I mean, my business every day is trying to put myself out of business, right? But understanding that, you know, that we also have the here and now and the things that we have to deal with, to the point that we discussed earlier, I'm pushing really hard for us to be able to provide more mental health beds, for instance. We know that we have a tremendous problem with, you know, the impact of mental health in our streets. And, you know, the criminal legal system doesn't really offer a good solution for this, right? Our jails are not a good place to deal with people that have severe mental health problems. But today, we don't have enough mental health beds available in our county. And there has to be a tier process, right? Not everybody needs to be in a secure bed, meaning that you're in a kind of a semi-locked up or locked up setting, but we have to have some of those. And we have to have, you know, the ones that are sort of, that providing a sort of outpatient services. So for me, that's really important. The other thing that we're trying to get more support for is restorative justice. Having the capacity to mainstream the work around restorative justice. And for those of you that may not fully understand that, restorative justice is really a process where, first of all, you admit that there was harm done, And then it's about harm mitigation, and it's bringing all the parties together. The person that caused the harm, has to bring some self-awareness to the table. And then it's focusing around the victim or the survivor to make sure that we do everything that we can to repair the harm, and then come up with solution interventions that are not just simply based on punishment, but are based also in looking for a rehabilitative path. So spending more money on that is something that I'm very, very aggressively seeking. So I think that it's really uplifting the reality that much of our work is about public health, and that yes, some people are dangerous at a moment in time, and we have to separate them from the rest of us, but using that tool in a very mindful, very thoughtful way, understanding that their race and racism and implicit bias plays a role in the system, and that unless we address that, we lack credibility in some communities. Part of there's a social compact, right? And part of that is that we have to believe that the system is there for us. Mm-hmm. And if we have segments of our community that do not believe that the system is there for them, then there's that lack of trust. People don't report crimes. They do not want to cooperate with authorities in order to solve crimes. You create these vacuums. So it's shifting the conversation, mm-hmm. And we still need to have good, solid policing, well-funded. We obviously have to have, well-funded court systems and prosecutors, but it's also not mm-hmm. using that as the entire solution, because it's not the solution. The solution is really creating healthier community environments.
Yeah, part of the irony is what you describe as restorative justice. Yes, it is. If you look as a Christian, I'll say, if you look in the New Testament, yes. This is actually the type of justice that Jesus talks about.
It's a Christian thing to do.
It is. It is the basis of our theology of reconciliation. And the irony is some of those people who shout the loudest about this as a Christian nation are the ones whose version of justice is much more retributive and less than the justice of Jesus.
It's less Christian.
Yeah, it's less Christian. And so restorative justice I'm going to stop preaching here, but it has been shown to work, and it actually does rebuild communities. One more, and then I would want to just leave people a chance to ask their own questions. So you've been in this job since December 2020, so it's been 2 years.
2 years.
What do you know? And these are questions I ask myself all the time. What do you know now that you didn't know at the beginning? And is there anything that you would go back and do differently if you could?
Yeah, I think that the pandemic really created a whole different set of circumstances, right? That I don't think any of us were prepared for it. I don't think there was a playbook for this, right? I came into office, and there are some people here in the audience that work with me, and especially Josephine was who came up with me to the 12th floor, which is where the executive level is in the building, and there was no one in the office, right? Because we were working from home or people were ill. I started to go through the entire county. We have 22 different facilities around the county, and I would walk into places that I may see 2 or 3 individuals in a place that maybe has 30 or 40 or 50 people working there. And that created it was disconcerting to me, because I'm used to, and I recognize that so much of what we do is about human contact, right? It's about, me being here with you not only hearing what I'm saying, hopefully listening, but more importantly, you're seeing me, right? We did this before in Zoom,
right?
Yeah. With many of you, right? It's not the same, right? Yes, it was a good proxy when you had no other alternative, but it's very different that you see in my facial expression, seeing, being up close. Well, we went through a year and a half of, I couldn't do that, right? Yeah. So I go back now and what would I have done differently? And I think that I needed to try harder to get closer to the workforce. I'm not sure what that would look like, but I definitely would certainly try a lot harder to do that. But I also don't dwell on it because,
Right.
again, I mean, it was just such a hard time.
Right. Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. I want to turn it over to you all. Questions from over here. We'll start out with Sandy.
Hi, we seem to have a new sheriff in the county and a new chief of police in Pasadena. I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, which has been attacked in many other jurisdictions, both by very conservative people and apparently by the Attorney General in Texas, who's trying to get change of gender information out of the DMV system. What are your thoughts about the new sheriff, the new chief of police, the interactions with your office, and in the long run, since they're both interested in community policing, what we might be able to do to build stronger relationships between your office, police who are a little more thoughtful about the work that they're doing because their oversight is changing, and what we can do to cut down on hate crimes against LGBTQ, minority populations.
Yeah, well, I actually want to start with the back end of your question because, how to cut down on hate crimes. We have seen an incredible amount of hate against the LGBTQ community. We've seen it against other communities, by the way. Still, the African American community continues to be the number one recipient of hate. But we've seen, increases in the AAPI community. But I think when it comes to the LGBTQ community specifically, we have seen a concerted effort by elected officials around this country to single out members of the LGBTQ community, members of the trans community, and that has resulted in increased violence and hate. And I would say that we all have to stand up collectively in order to make sure that there is a stop to that, right? And, I know that many of you subscribe to this, but the reality is that a hate crime against one of us is a hate crime against all of us, right? And unless we collectively stand up together and not only show that we will stand up with every community that is being singled out and is being victimized, but that we are going to do everything that we can, both lawfully and socially, to ensure that that behavior changes and there are consequences for those that are there pushing for hate. It will continue. And in the case of political elected officials, we have to make sure that they get called out, that they don't get reelected. And I know that in some jurisdictions, that might be a popular view that they're espousing, but we need to stand up and fight for that. And that's why one of the reasons, frankly, that I'm very active at the national level with other prosecutors that are working in some of those communities to make sure that they have space. We have been supporting a elected DA in Florida, for instance, where Governor DeSantis unceremoniously took him out of office, suspended him because he came out publicly and signed up to a statement that many of us put together saying that we would protect women's reproductive rights anywhere. And he was actually suspended. So I think we have to stand up together and we cannot give up, right? We have to be dogged about it. And I think that if we do that, we will prevail. I think to the question concerning the sheriff and the chief of police here in Pasadena, I'll start actually with, the chief of police in Pasadena. He is the head of the county chiefs. And he was a gentleman that I was referring to that came to this press conference representing all other county chiefs and basically stood up there with us and talked about how it was important to recognize that this was a public health problem first and that we were all going to work and that we could not go back to the failed policies of the 80s and 90s. So that was a lot of hope for me. The new sheriff is someone that I believe is an honorable man. I believe that he is very committed to doing the ethical things for the sheriff's department. We came from 4 years of upheaval with that organization. And so I'm very hopeful, and we are already having conversations, and we're talking about how to work and do the things differently, because, we do have real problems, right? We do have an increase in violence, especially homicides. It's not as high as it was back in the days when I used to be a young officer on the streets, but we've had an increase in homicides around the nation, by the way, not just in LA County. In fact, proportionally, which is something that often the sort of the tough on crime people won't tell you, that proportionally the jurisdictions that have this hardcore prosecutors are having bigger increases than we are. In fact, Kern County, San Bernardino County, Riverside have bigger increases per capita than we've had in LA, right? And that's never talked about. So I am very hopeful that you're seeing a new direction by law enforcement in this county, that together we're going to start moving in different directions to address the increases in violence, the public health problem, epidemic that we have with fentanyl that is killing our young people. Those are real problems that need real solutions, and real solutions are not locking up people that are addicted to drugs. Is addressing, reducing the harm, providing the tools for schools to educate, for parents who understand the dangers. And yes, we will go after the traffickers, but that cannot be the only solution.
Hi, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for everything you've done since you've taken office. I'm a big supporter of all of your policies. I'm a deputy public defender, been doing that for 20 years, so I've been through several DAs in LA County. Here's what I'm seeing and what my question is. There seems to be a really big disconnect from the management team at the DA's office and the line. And it's really a problem. It's a big problem. So just this past week, talking to my colleagues, what we see every day is your deputies in court very sarcastically repeating your policies to the judge, and then the judge says, I won't accept that. They're all undermining you, or many, including the judges, which is very sad and very, problematic. I get what you both were talking about really resonates, that this takes a long time, systemic change takes a long time, and that's what's happening, I think, right? My question is, what can be done over the next couple years to actually get buy-in from your deputies? Because I don't think just ordering them to do the policies that you've implemented that are wonderful policies is working. I think there needs to be a real effort to educate them, train them, and get buy-in from them for there to actually be real change in the courtrooms.
Yeah, and look, let me start by saying we have a very strict civil service structure in LA County, right? So I want to kind of have you walk with me for a moment. Imagine Joe Biden becoming the president and having Donald Trump's cabinet, okay? Having Donald Trump's attorney general, having Donald Trump's chief of staff, right? That is the reality of what I walk into, right? So a lot of the people that aggressively campaign against me, that have supported recalls, are still in supervisory and management positions. And that's my reality. But what it is happening, and I know that it's hard for you to see at the ground level because you're right there with dealing with the trees. I'm trying to deal with the forest, but understanding what's going down at the lower level, is that the reality is, if you look at the number of kids that are being prosecuted as adults, right, it's almost none, right? I know that there are some kids that are being put in quote-unquote placeholders, but last year only 3 kids were transferred to adult court. We're not sending anybody to death row, right? We have now filed on police officers for misconduct, criminal misconduct. Now I believe it's like 28 cases, more than in almost in decades before. The number of enhancements that are being used and the level of incarceration has dropped substantially. So there is movement. Also, for the first time, when I first came into office, and we were under a hiring freeze, your office as well, then we were given the approval to hire. We were hiring from a list that had been created in 2018, which may or may not necessarily be people that reflected the way that I want to do the work. But for the first time now this year, we have just hired 2 classes of people that came to the job. They apply under my administration. They have actually, interestingly enough, come from other counties that are very regressive, and they have come to us because they want to do the work the way that we're doing it. So we've hired now, 30-some people, and we'll continue to hire people that want to do the work differently. We're also creating a safe space. I get often deputy district attorneys that will reach out to me and say, I'm trying to do the work differently, but my supervisor will not allow me, right? Or I get ridiculed, or, I'm singled out. So, that is slowly evolving. So I believe that a combination of new hires, some people retiring, right after the last recall failed, there was a significant number of people that decided to hang it up. And when I get reelected in 2 years, which with your help, I believe that I will, there will be additional people that would leave. You start shifting the culture. And then, frankly, we need the help of people like you to tell us when there is bad behavior in the courts, because I'm going to tell you some of the problems that I face. I've had people tell me, for instance, when a deputy district attorney has used racist comments in the courtroom. And I said, okay, can you put that in writing? Because, again, we're in a civil service world where I have to have, evidence, and all of a sudden say, well, I don't want to do that because I have to work with this person every day. So, frankly, that doesn't help me at all, right? It doesn't help all of us. So I think that there is movement. It will take some time, but I think when you look, you take a step back and you actually look at the big picture, there has been a tremendous amount of advancement, and that will continue to be the case. And frankly, by 2023, I expect that even to accelerate, because we're putting more and more people in places of authority that are believers in this kind of work and are moving forward.
I kind of want to piggyback on the last question. First of all, thank you for all you're doing. We're going the right direction, and even though there's some hiccups in it, I think we got to stay the course. I'm a social worker, and for most of my career was in community mental health. So I have sat with families who have been victims. I have sat with families who perpetrators in them, and sat in courtrooms more times than I want to talk about on both sides of it. What I have heard in the last 2 years that has surprised me in terms of backlash, and it may be a little of the same of not getting buy-in, is specifically with interfamily violence or inter-home violence, whether they're related or not, and I want to say the complaints have been mostly about the sheriff's department, which may be understandable, are using your name as to why they can't do anything. So, especially if it's a misdemeanor. I mean, one comment was, I don't see blood, there's no felony, they're not going to get held, so what do you want me to do? Gascón isn't letting us do anything. And it's been more than once, and it's unique to the family system dynamic, and COVID probably made it worse because you can't evict somebody from your home, even if they're your son, brother, you can't in the COVID world without all those extra things, and that's very hard on a family. So I'm getting told, I won't call the police anymore, I just have to suck it up. And so people are living in violent situations and they blame you for it. I have all sorts of thoughts about how we can deal with domestic violence without cops, but we don't have great diversion programs. I mean, I believe in diversion. I worked at Measure R. They're mediocre. I mean, let's be honest. Because I've worked with them. And so how can we get different responses while you're doing what we absolutely need to do? How can we get different responses to some of those very vulnerable situations, which feels like in this interim time, maybe even at more risk right now?
Yeah, and you know, the interesting thing, and by the way, this has been, I think it's dissipating, but you know, there was almost a concerted effort by some members of the police agencies to not take action, right? Our misdemeanor policies, when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to driving under the influence, when it comes to assault, stalking, we're prosecuting at the same levels that prior administrations have. So there's absolutely no reduction in those prosecutions, so that is untrue. There is also a problem that often is not said, and we are dealing with this. About 50% of the county population, their misdemeanor prosecutions are done by city attorneys. In fact, the city of Pasadena has their own city attorney. So if you're the victim of a misdemeanor in Pasadena, my office doesn't deal with that as a city attorney. But I often hear, in fact, I've seen, and I know this because we got video, of an LAPD officer telling someone, well, you know, there's nothing I can do because Gascón won't prosecute misdemeanors, even though the city of LA has their own misdemeanor prosecutor. As a matter of fact, I have a kind of a funny anecdote because someone was broken into their home. Police officers, LAPD officers came in and they said, well, you know, yeah, you have video and all that stuff, but the Gascón won't prosecute this case. The gentleman happened to be a friend of my wife. He had my cell number, so he offered to call me so that we could have a conversation. And, you know, in different terms, he used more profane terms. So he said, I thought I had to go get the toilet paper to deal with the officer's reaction to when I offered to call you. So I think that, you know, this is where public education comes in. You need to push back. When you hear an officer say to your client, the DA won't prosecute this misdemeanor domestic violence, the first thing you have to ask yourself is this part of the county that the DA handles misdemeanors? Because if it's Pasadena, it's not. But if it is, then you have to push back and say that's absolutely incorrect. Why don't we call the DA's office right now? Okay.
Thank you. We're at 1:45, so we need to say goodbye. Everyone turn and wave at the camera. We're going to say goodbye to our online audience because Keith has to get into the church for the 10 o'clock service. Can we thank District Attorney Gascón for being here with us? Thank you so much. If you want to stick around a few minutes just to talk to people in here, that would be great. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.